message, we're doing things a little bit differently. I've got a very, very special guest speaker that I'm going to introduce to you shortly. And but before we do that, I just, as a means of introduction, I've just been thinking a bit lately around the story that we find in the Gospels of Jesus and his interaction with Peter, one of his followers. Getting towards the time when Jesus would be crucified, he's meeting together with his disciples, and his disciples are kind of having a bit of an argument amongst themselves about who's the best, who's the greatest. And Jesus is, I picture him just shaking his head at those moments and going, what is wrong with you guys? Why can't you get with the program? But in the midst of it all, Jesus says this to Peter, who's also known as Simon. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. But then Simon or Peter says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison or to death. He's like, man, I'm so sure of myself. And Jesus says to him, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. And it amazes me, this part of the story, because Jesus knew Peter better than Peter knew Peter, right? Jesus knew Peter's heart. Jesus knew, despite what Peter thought and what Peter said, Jesus knew what was inside of Peter. And yet, in knowing that, what really amazes me is that Jesus doesn't just walk away from Peter, knowing what's in him. And it's part of the beauty and the good news of the Christian faith, is that as human beings, whatever we think about ourselves, we've got stuff. We all have stuff that we carry inside of us that is, we're very much works in progress. We are. And Jesus knows that. And Jesus has a full understanding of everything inside of us, the things that often we aren't even aware of that is inside of us, that is broken, that is so far away from what his heart and his intent is. He knows about it all. But that knowledge does not cause Jesus to turn away in horror or disgust or disappointment. Jesus knows us and loves us, even in our profound imperfection and brokenness. I marvel at that and thank Jesus for that every day. Like, it's good news. It really, really is. Jesus knew that Peter would deny him 3 times. Like, this was Jesus in his hour of need when he's enduring such horrific treatment. And this is one of his closest friends who denies any attachment or knowledge of Jesus when the heat came on. Like, talk about a fail, eh? Jesus knew that would happen and yet loved Peter. And after it all happened, when Peter is just feeling rotten, like when that rooster crowed, how would you feel if you were Peter in that moment? Like, to be confronted with your own weakness and inadequacy and brokenness is not an easy thing. And we get a glimpse in the Gospels of Peter in himself not even really knowing how to deal with that or how to process that. But Jesus, the risen Jesus, comes to Peter again to draw him close and to help him process and find closure for the things that had happened in the past. I love that and marvel at how good Jesus is to us and how faithful he is. And so kind of our theme for this morning is to really explore the goodness of God in helping us as broken, imperfect people to find freedom. Jesus' heart for every single one of us, no matter what our history has been, no matter what choices we may have made that were really wrong, dumb, stupid, all of the above, and we've all got some of them, right? No matter what that's been, no matter what decisions other people may have been made that have affected us, Jesus' heart is that each of us would, in knowing him, find freedom, find healing, find hope and know that there is a future that is not limited by what we have been through in the past. Amen? That's part of the good news. And so it's my pleasure this morning to hand over to a wonderful young lady who's part of our church community, Gianna Clark. Gianna is awesome. As she comes, just by means of a little bit of introduction, I actually known Gianna personally since she was about that tall, since way back in, we've got some baby photos. No, we don't. No, but again, it's just been such a joy, I think, especially in the last year and a half, just seeing what God is doing in Gianna's life. And last year, Gianna finished Teachers College, which was amazing. And where it would have been really easy to go, cool, I've graduated, I can get into teaching now, she just felt a real stirring within her heart that maybe God had something different. And she felt God calling her, instead of just going straight into teaching, to take some time out and enroll for Elim Leadership College, which for us as Elim churches in New Zealand, there are interns from all around the country of all sorts of ages and stages of life who are just sensing something of a call of God and giving space and time to invest into that and be prepared for what God may have in future. So since the start of this year, Gianna's been on this internship journey. She's serving as a leader of our young adults ministry here at Burnside, and she's doing an incredible job. But what I see God doing in this, this is kind of awkward me talking about you while you're right here, eh? But what I see God doing in you, Gianna, is you just keep saying yes to Jesus. What he is doing in you and through you is so inspiring. And so this morning, I've invited Gianna to speak a little bit about her own personal journey of finding freedom in such a wonderful and unexpected way. And our prayer and our heart is that this would be a great encouragement for all of us this morning about what Jesus' heart is for us and what he can do when we just say yes to him. So would you give Gianna a hand as she comes to share this morning?
Thank you. Yes, no. Okay, I am shorter than Phil, so I will be standing on the stage. However, before I get started today, as you could tell, we are talking about emotions. So there are a few things that I'll be briefly touching on, which is cyberbullying, earthquakes, and depression. So please know that if any of these affect you, we are all here for you and we do love you. So, for most of my life, in order to push through pain and hurt, I have put my emotions in a box to ignore. For a little bit of context, I have been through a fair few traumas in my life, for most of which I have sought counselling for many, many years to process and accept. For example, I was born and raised in Christchurch, which, having lived in Christchurch, means that we've lived through the earthquakes, which was quite traumatic in itself. I couldn't deal with that trauma, and so I put it in a box to ignore. Having lived through the first two major earthquakes at the age of 8 was quite traumatic, and it produced a lot of fear, and it produced a lot of uncertainty. I still couldn't deal with it, and so I put it in a box to ignore. Even today, I still react when a truck drives by and it shakes the house. However, a trauma that has shaped me into the person that I am today is when I was cyberbullied. When I was 13 years old, I was convinced by a friend online that they were actually not 14 as previously stated, but that they were a 40-year-old man who had been stalking me since I was 8. After working with the police, we found a few months later that it was actually just my best friend pretending to be a 40-year-old stalker. From this, I understandably did not feel safe anywhere, and as I spent a few months convinced that I was going to be kidnapped or murdered or something. And instead, I ended up with trust issues and friendships. Due to the fear of it all, I ended up not leaving the home very much, as I was far too anxious to leave the house. I slowly became depressed and hopeless, as I thought there was a stalker coming after me. I ended up being afraid most of the day, living in fear, living in sadness, living out of hopelessness. At the time, I had sadly lost some hope in God, and so I found that the only way through this situation was to put all of my emotions in a box and ignore them. This is a habit that I've continued for many years. I even put my frustration around my chronic pain into this box. With all my emotions safely inside this box where I could ignore them, I closed the lid and I didn't address it again. So while this habit did allow me to move on and allowed me to live, I was no longer truly living. There was a part of me that was shut down, and I treated emotions as the enemy, something that should be avoided at all costs. Happiness was allowed, but I could not let myself feel sad or angry or anything, no matter what. During this time, I recall reading some scriptures that made me feel that I had made the right choice in this decision. I understood these scriptures to be saying that emotions are untrustworthy, that negative emotions shouldn't be felt, and that I was told to never be afraid. And so unfortunately, I didn't deal with this box until almost 10 years later, when I slowly and healthily started opening this box back up. So I know that each of us have faced many difficulties in life, whether they are similar or vastly different to mine. Each of our traumas and life experiences have the potential to hurt us and leave us figuring out our own coping mechanisms to survive. So I hope that this message reaches you, no matter where you are on your journey or how similar your coping mechanism is to mine. As stated, I'm studying at Elim Leadership College. And this year, I've had it pop up many times and rest on my heart to actually look at this box. I have found that God is telling me to unlearn this habit, to feel my emotions as they are, and to live as Christ lived, to trust in Him to protect and strengthen me. And I know that this part of my journey is lifelong. It's something that I'll be working on for a very long time to come. However, I can already see the life that Jesus is adding to this area of my life and helping me to live life fully. Already there is a sense of freedom coming from opening up this box. So no matter where you are in your journey or what life has taken you through, there is hope in knowing that Jesus brings freedom and peace through these experiences. But what does the Bible actually tell us about emotions? How can this help us to understand their importance and place in our lives? So as a Christian, or through the church as a whole, how often have you heard to not be fearful, to never worry, to not feel depressed or sad? It is a very lovely sentiment, primarily based on scriptures such as Philippians 4:6-7. If we could change the slide. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Or even in Joshua 1:9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Or in John 14:27, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Let your hearts not be troubled, neither let them be afraid. However, if we are not careful, these can unintentionally build up the idea within us that we, as Christians, are not allowed to feel negative emotions. That if we do, we must be sinning or not trusting God enough. So something that I've noticed in these verses in particular is that they use the word be. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Do not be troubled. I understand the word be as a state of fully existing that encompasses a person, where every thought is focused on the emotion. For example, for a person to be afraid means that they are showing it on the outside. They're fully living in a state of fear. To be happy means that they're in a full state of happiness. They're smiling and laughing. However, to feel afraid is a bit more gentle. It means to experience the emotion, but not let it fully take over, nor let it stop you from living, nor letting your thoughts go down rabbit holes that just make the emotion worse. To feel happy means to experience it, to feel upbeat. However, there is another important distinction to make, that to be something means that is solely what you feel. To be afraid is have that be all that you feel. While on the other hand, you can feel multiple emotions at once. You can feel happy and excited about preaching whilst also feeling very nervous about it. So when we are called to not be afraid, we are called to not live in a state of fear with rampant thoughts that stop us from living. Instead, it is human to feel afraid, to see a danger coming at you and react with fear. It is human to feel these emotions, but it is dangerous to let them take over. For guidance in this, we can look at verses like Psalm 56:3. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. It isn't telling us to recognize that we are feeling afraid and shove that emotion in a box to ignore and then trust the Lord. We are asked to feel the feeling and trust God through the emotion. Or in Ephesians 4:26-27, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Again, it is not saying to acknowledge the feeling of anger and shove it in a box to ignore. It is telling us that when we are feeling angry, we need to be careful to not be reckless and sin, nor to go to bed angry. We are essentially told to recognize this feeling, to feel it, and to correct the feeling before we go to sleep. So emotions are not the enemy. Emotions are part of how God has created us, and it is God's heart for us that we learn how to recognize our emotions and express them in ways that are both good for us and good for other people. This is not something that we're expected to do on our own. Instead, we have God with His Holy Spirit to help us with this learning process. We can also take refuge in the fact that Jesus is our perfect example to live by. Jesus showed us how to put up boundaries, how to take time to yourself to re-energize, and to pray consistently. We are called time and time again to live as Jesus lived. We actually see this in 1 John 2:6. Whoever claims to live in Him must live as Jesus did. This more often relates to serving others, to preaching His name, and to following His commandments. However, it is equally important to live as Jesus lived in such ways as taking rest and allowing yourself time to be quiet and just as He did. We even see in Matthew 14:23 that Jesus sent His disciples off and went up on a mountain to be by Himself to pray. Or in Mark 1:35, where Jesus went off to a solitary place to be with God. There are many other times where Jesus went off to a solitary place to be on His own with God. Jesus is displaying here time and time again that it is okay to find a solitary place to be on your own with God for a time. Jesus shows us how well it can benefit a person and that we are allowed to take time to ourselves to re-energize or even to refocus. We even see in Matthew 11:28-29, where Jesus tells us to come to Him when we are weary and burdened, and He will give us rest. He asks that we take His yoke upon us to learn from Him. The major turning point that I had in my trauma journey was realizing that I could not do it alone. I knew that in my own strength, I could not live life to its fullest, nor climb out of this hole that I had found myself in, which is hard to accept when you love to be independent. This is when I found that I can go to God anytime, anywhere, for anything. That when I am weak, He is strong, and that I am able to go to Him where I was, and He would meet me there. From there on, anytime I was weary and burdened, I took it to God, especially after the day that I found my favorite Bible verse, 1 Peter 5:7. Cast your anxiety onto Him because He cares for you. Knowing He cares for me changed the way that I viewed my life and reminded me that I can go to God for rest. So what can we do to manage our emotions well? More recently, a Bible verse that I've been meditating on is John 11:35, more commonly known as the shortest verse. Jesus wept. It seems like such a short, insignificant verse. Incidentally, it's also a great place to start if you want to learn a Bible verse. It is just 2 words. So, it is a great place to start. However, having taken some time to meditate on this verse, and especially acknowledging the idea that Jesus came to earth fully human and experienced emotions in hard times, shows me that feeling our emotions is healthy. The idea that if Jesus wept, why can't I? But Jesus did not weep here for any small thing. We actually read in John 11 that Jesus had heard news that his closest friend Lazarus had died after being sick. Jesus had just discussed with his disciples that he would go and wake Lazarus up from his sleep. Upon arriving at Bethany, where Lazarus was from, Jesus had a conversation with Martha, the sister to Lazarus, where he said that her brother would rise again. Both of these times, Jesus discreetly makes known that he will raise Lazarus from the dead. However, after making these claims and before going to Lazarus' tomb, Jesus stops and weeps. Jesus knew here that he could and would bring Lazarus back from the dead, but still he mourned the loss of his friend first. He let himself feel the overwhelming emotions and wept. This has been sitting on my heart as it shows me that we shouldn't ignore our negative emotions, but instead we should give ourselves a moment to feel them before we move on and do what needs to be done. Alongside this passage, we read in Matthew 26:36-46 about how Jesus was overcome with sorrow in Gethsemane. This passage comes shortly before Jesus' arrest and subsequent crucifixion. Jesus knew that he was going to die a horrible death on the cross. He was not surprised or caught off guard by anything that had happened to him. He fully knew the fate that he would suffer, whilst also knowing the outcome of coming back to life. Despite knowing the amazing ending to come, he was still overcome with emotion, asking his Father to save him or change the plan. However, he still submitted to his Father's will. Through this passage, it mentions how sorrowful Jesus was, how he let himself feel these emotions, and as we read in Luke 22:44, he even became so anguished that he sweat blood before asking his Father for strength to push through. So in dealing with our emotions, it is important to remember that what we feel and what state of heart we are coming from is where we will be ministering and teaching from. A great verse to look at for this is Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Whether you are talking to a friend, preaching at church, doing work, or cooking for your family, everything you do flows from your heart. If you are in a state of fear, you will be trying to support your friends and family from that state. However, if you learn to acknowledge these emotions and turn them around, you will be coming from a healed heart and from a state of peace from God. Something that we can do to support ourselves in this state is actually to talk to trusted people about what is happening in our lives. This does mean opening up to a few trusted people and not just talking to anyone, anywhere at random. When it comes to addressing our emotions, the two greatest commandments actually come into play. In Matthew 22:37-40, Jesus says, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." When we learn to accept and process our emotions, we are practicing self-love. However, as said in 1 John 4:8, to know love is to know God. Therefore, to truly love ourselves, we must first love God with all our heart, all our mind, and all our soul. However, the main reason that I want to talk about these two commandments today is because the second part of the second greatest commandment is often overlooked or forgotten entirely. People often say, "Love your neighbor," and leave it there, which is absolutely lovely. Please do not get me wrong. However, the second half is just as important. Love your neighbor as yourself. If a person is depressed or full of self-hate, how can they truly love someone else? Wherever your heart is postured towards yourself is where your heart is postured towards others. This is why it is so important to be kind to yourself and allow yourself some time to feel your emotions. Another example of this is that if we are pouring out all of our energy and time onto other people and never giving ourselves a second, we're only going to run into burnout. And this is not something that anyone can continue doing long term. However, if we allow ourselves some time for ourselves, we are able to be in a much better position to help other people. We can also even take guidance from 2 Corinthians 1:4. He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we are able to give them the same comfort God has given us. So there are 4 main things that I would like you to take away from today. 1, there is an important distinction between being and feeling. We're allowed to feel our emotions. We just need to be careful that we don't let them take over or that we ignore them altogether. 2, Jesus is our perfect example, and we are called to live as he lived. It is healthy to take time away, to be alone with God, and to depend on him to empower us every day, just like Jesus did. 3rd, Jesus gave himself time to feel his emotions, so why can't we? Jesus is our perfect example, and we are called to follow in his footsteps every day. 4, care for yourself so that you can care for others. You need to take time to yourself and care for yourself so that you are actually able to care for others. So whilst the Bible tells us to be careful about what we feel and how much we feel them, it is important to acknowledge your emotions, to feel them, to then move on. We cannot truly live if we do not give our emotions a chance to be felt. So, if Jesus wept, why can't you?